Hello and welcome to the last in our series of nominally London lectures on the theme of expanding horizons. I'm Julian Bagini and I'm the Academic Director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. In this series, we have been both celebrating and promoting the ways in which philosophy in the English-speaking world has been expanding its horizons over recent years, taking in wider areas of interest, new questions, engaging with other traditions and other disciplines. If you go to our YouTube channel, have a look back at what we've had over the course of the year, you'll see it's been extremely diverse. And I think we're finishing the series on another talk which really does sort of take us to areas which certainly perhaps when I was an undergraduate you wouldn't even think would come up on the philosophy syllabus, much to my and my peers' loss. Our speaker this evening is Jonardon Ganeri. He's the Bimal K. Matilal Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Toronto. He's a Fellow of the British Academy. And his work draws on, he is a model of an expanding horizons philosopher. He draws on a variety of philosophical traditions to construct new positions in the philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and epistemology. And he's a great advocate for an expanded role for cross-cultural methodologies in philosophical research, and his research subjects include areas of inquiry such as the consciousness, self, attention, and the idea of philosophy as a practice and its relationship to literature. He's written several books, including Attention, Not Self, Inwardness, An Outsider's Guide, which I think is especially accessible for people who are not studying or steeped in philosophy. And most recently, a book which relates to the subject of his talk today, Virtual Subjects, Fugitive Selves, Fernando Pessoa and his philosophy. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to hear Jonardon's talk, and then afterwards we're going to have a discussion. And we would welcome your contributions to that discussion. So if you'd like to pose a question, please do just enter it into the chat function on YouTube or Facebook, depending on where you're watching, if you're watching this live. And just two requests. Please do, before you press send, please just have a look at your question. Make sure it kind of fits into the one box and doesn't spill over into several, and just ask yourself, would someone else reading it really understand what I mean by this? The problem of doing these things online is we don't get that chance to ask for clarification. So that will come later, but first of all, sit back and let's hear Jonardon Ganeri talking about Fernando Pessoa, the poet, as philosopher.
So, Fernando Pessoa, the poet as philosopher. Fernando Pessoa, whose dates are 1888 to 1935, has become many things to many people in the years that have passed since his untimely death. For some, he's simply the greatest poet of the 20th century, certainly in Portuguese and arguably more widely. His poetry, much loved and widely read, has over the years been meticulously edited, published, and translated. For others, he's gradually emerged as a forgotten voice of 20th century modernism, now finally taking his rightful place alongside giants such as C.P. Cavafy, Franz Kafka, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Jorge Luis Borges. And yet, Pessoa was also a philosopher, and it's only very recently that the philosophical importance of his work has begun to attract the attention it deserves. Decisively breaking with the conventional strictures of systematic philosophical writing, the philosophy in his poems and his prose antinovel is a profound and exquisite exploration in the philosophy of self. Fernando Pessoa lived what was in many ways an astonishingly modern, transcultural and translingual life. He was born in Lisbon, the point of departure for Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, as commemorated by Pessoa's forebear, the poet Luís de Camões. Pessoa grew up in Anglophone Durban, South Africa, acquiring a lifelong love for English poetry and language. Returning to Lisbon, from where he would never again leave, he set himself the goal to travel throughout an infinitude of inner landscapes, to be an explorer of inner worlds. He published very little, but left behind a famous trunk containing a treasure trove of scraps on which were written some of the greatest literary works of the 20th century, mainly in Portuguese, but also substantially in English and French. Pessoa's slow reception since his death is largely accounted for by the enormous task of sorting through, reading and translating this handful of notes. Fernando Pessoa's invention of the concept of what he called a heteronym, which I'm going to explain, represents a singular moment in the history of subjectivity. Scattered amongst his drafts of prefaces to never-to-be-completed editions of his writings, and in letters to friends and editors, are the few explicit clues we possess as to his intentions. The mental origin of my heteronyms, he says, lies in my restless organic tendency to depersonalization and simulation, already isolating the twin poles around which his philosophy of self revolves. Before continuing, fortunately for me and others, these phenomena have been mentally internalized, such that they don't show up in my outer everyday life among people. They erupt inside me, where only I experience them. Each heteronym is fully and in its own right a person. Ever since I was a child, he says, I felt the need to enlarge the world with fictitious personalities, dreams of mine that were carefully crafted, envisaged with photographic clarity, and fathomed to the depths of their souls. I intensely conceived these characters with no need for dolls. Distinctly visible in my ongoing dreams, they were utterly human realities for me, which any doll, because unreal, would have spoiled. They, that is the heteronyms, were people. Pessoa's three most famous heteronyms are the world-class poets he names Alberto Cairo, Álvaro de Campos, and Ricardo Reich. I placed all my power of dramatic depersonalization in Cairo, he says. I placed all my mental discipline, clothed in its own special music, in Ricardo Reich. And in Álvaro de Campos, I placed all the emotion that I deny myself and don't put into life. As he puts it in a draft preface for an unfinished edition of the fictions of the interlude, his designation for the complete corpus of his poetic work. In the case of the authors of the fictions of the interlude, it's not only the ideas and feelings which differ from mine, the technique of composition itself, the very style, differs from mine. In those instances, each protagonist is created as essentially different, not just differently thought out. For this reason, poetry is predominant in fictions of the interlude. In prose, it's more difficult to other oneself. So heteronymy is, as the name implies, an othering of oneself, an awareness of oneself, but as other. The contrast with the pseudonym is deliberate. Pessoa writes, pseudonymous works are by the author in his own person, except in the name he signs. Heteronymic works are by the author outside his own person. They proceed from a full-fledged individual created by him. A pseudonym is a mask, a disguise intended, even if only ironically, to hide the true identity of the author. A heteronym is something else entirely. It's the author writing outside his own person, and in doing so transforming himself into an other I. A heteronym occupies the first-person position within the experience of the author, and has a defined literary voice and a distinctive power of expression. So to write in the name of a heteronym is not to hide oneself behind a mask, but to live in experience as that very person. Each heteronym, Pessoa says, is lived by the author within himself and has passed through his soul. A heteronym is someone in me who has taken my place. In assuming a heteronym, one transforms oneself into another I. First, we must create another I, he says, charged with suffering, in and for us, everything we suffer. The experiences of my heteronym are both in me, in the sense that I am their host, and also for me, standing with respect to me in a first personal and subjective relationship. When Pessoa writes of heteronymy, that it's a subjective state in which every felt pain is automatically analysed to the core, ruthlessly foisted on an extraneous I, he exactly formulates the essence of the concept in the idea of an experience that is at once irreducibly first personal and yet also alien. A heteronym is a fully formed subject subsisting within one's own conscious experience. Heteronyms are, to introduce a notion I'm going to say more about later, virtual subjects, subjects which are well-defined personalities who have incorporeally passed through one's soul. Unlike the target of empathy, which would occupy a second-person position addressed as you, the formal feature which is definitive of heteronymy is that a heteronym occupies the first-person position, spoken of with the use of the first-person pronoun I. A heteronym possesses agency, if only in the capacity to compose verse, and has its own expressive and experiential style. A heteronym is another I, an I who is not me, an othered I. Pessoa writes, "But since I am me, I merely take a little pleasure in the little that it is to imagine myself as that someone else. Yes, soon he, I, under a tree or bower, will eat twice what I can eat, drink twice what I dare drink, and laugh twice what I can conceive of laughing. Soon he, now I. Yes, for a moment I was someone else. In someone else I saw and lived this human and humble joy of existing as an animal in shirt sleeves." So heteronymic simulation is, we might say, a mechanism of self-alienation. If transforming oneself in simulation into another I is the core of the idea of heteronymic subjectivity, an equally important theme in Pessoa is that of depersonalization. Living through a heteronym, which from one point of view must certainly constitute an enrichment of experiential life, is paradoxically described in terms of a loss of self. Today I have no personality. I've divided all my humaneness among the various authors whom I've served as literary executor. Today I'm the meeting place of a small humanity that belongs only to me. I subsist as a kind of medium of myself, but I'm less real than the others, less substantial, less personal, and easily influenced by them all. Again, he says, "I created a non-existent coterie, placing it all in a framework of reality. I ascertained the influences at work and the friendships between them. I listened in myself to their discussions and divergent points of view. And in all of this, it seemed that I, who created them all, was the one who was least there." Several distinct claims are intertwined here. The first is that even as he assumes multiple heteronyms, Pessoa is separately conscious of himself as in the capacity of medium or meeting place for them. Unlike a heteronym, which corresponds to a well-defined style of experiencing, this separate self-consciousness is one that's empty of any specific personality or content. It's a depersonalized self-awareness. The use of the first person in relation to this type of self-consciousness is thus quite distinct from that which figures in the self-expression of a heteronym. Second, one's awareness of oneself as medium or meeting place is less robust than one's awareness of oneself as another I, in the sense that it does not sustain as strong a sense of presence. And finally, one's self-awareness as meeting place is associated with a clearly identifiable trait, which is that it at least partially consists in a capacity to observe the heteronyms, both from the outside, as when Pessoa writes, "I see before me in the transparent but real space of dreams the faces and gestures of Cairo, Reich and Campos," and also, more importantly, from the inside, a partly introspective and partly empathic capacity to analyse and scrutinise the subjective character of the heteronymic mental life being lived through. It seems then that two distinct kinds of self-awareness are co-present in any act of heteronymic assimilation. A heteronymic self-awareness, which consists in an awareness of oneself as another I, living through a distinct set of experiences, emotions and moods. And what I will call a forumnal self-awareness, an awareness of oneself as hosting the heteronym, which is at the same time a place from which one's experiential life qua heteronym can be observed and analysed. It's from the first-person position of the forum that Bernardo Suarez, the semi-heteronymic narrator of the Book of Disquiet, speaks when he says, "For me it's never I who thinks, speaks or acts. It's always one of my dreams, which I momentarily embody, that thinks, speaks or acts for me. I open my mouth, but it's I another who speaks. The only thing I feel to be really mine is a huge incapacity, a vast emptiness, an incompetence for everything that is life." Pessoa describes Bernardo Suarez as a semi-heteronym because, he says, his personality, although not mine, doesn't differ from my own, but is a mere mutilation of it. He's me without my rationalism and emotions. His prose is the same as mine, except for certain formal restraint that reason imposes on my own writing. And the name Bernardo Suarez is also a semi-orthonym because the name is a mere mutilation of Fernando Pessoa, Bernardo differing from Fernando in only 2 letters, and Suarez an almost exact syllabic inversion of Pessoa. When Pessoa as Suarez writes that, due to my habit of dividing myself following 2 distinct mental operations at the same time, it's generally the case that as I lucidly and intensely adapt myself to what others are feeling, I simultaneously undertake a rigorously objective analysis of their unknown self, what they think and are. He shows a keen understanding of the co-presence of these 2 kinds of self-awareness, a simulating heteronymic self-awareness consisting in the adaptation to the feelings of another I, and a forumnal self-awareness consisting in objective analysis of what is thereby felt. The formal structure of Pessoa's philosophy of self is nowhere more clearly set out than in his celebrated late poem, Countless Lives Inhabiters. Countless lives inhabiters, I don't know when I think or feel who it is that thinks and feels. I'm merely the place where things are thought and felt. I have more than just one soul, there are more eyes than I myself. I exist, nevertheless, indifferent to them all. I silence them, I speak. The crossing urges of what I feel or do not feel struggle in who I am, but I ignore them. They dictate nothing to the I know. I write. When I think or feel, the first stanza says, it's one of many possible I's that is thinking or feeling. This heteronymic use of I is immediately juxtaposed with another use of I to refer to the place where things are thought or felt. The second stanza continues with this use, for it's only from the position of the forum that I can affirm that I have more than one soul. Each heteronym, taken individually, thinks of itself as a single unified self. The two uses of I, heteronymic and forumnal, are again juxtaposed in the final stanza. The urges, felt or unfelt, are the felt volitions of a heteronym, that is, of myself qua another I. But I, qua forumnal observer, disregard them. The poem's disconnecting air of paradox is a deliberate construct produced by the alternation without explicit indication of two quite distinct uses of I. There's a third use too, almost too pedestrian for Pessoa to mention, the standard and everyday use of I to refer indexically to whomsoever it is that has spoken or written it. As when Pessoa writes in a letter to a friend, I submitted the copies required by the Office of Propaganda. In the poem there is perhaps a trace of this third indexical use in the echoing phrases, I speak and I write. The disconnect between the heteronymic and the forumnal can be heard playing out in another poem, in which who I am, my heteronymic self, is contrasted with what I am, myself as forum. I don't know who my soul is, nor does it know who I am. Understand it? It would take time. Explain it? Don't know if I can. And in this misunderstanding between who I am and what I am, there is a whole other meaning lying between earth and sky. Now, the act of heteronymic self-transformation is quite different from that of inventing a character in a story. Pessoa alludes to the difference when, while noting that novelists and playwrights often endow the characters of their plays and novels with feelings and ideas that they insist are not their own, he adds, somewhat gnomically, that the authorship of heteronyms is the same in substance, although the form is different. What is fundamental to the notion of a heteronym is that it's an othered I, lived by the author within himself, that is to say, lived first personally. So a heteronym is not a character, because the relationship an author stands to an invented character is a third personal one. The point in question is analogous to the one William James makes when he says that it's impossible to reconcile the peculiarities of our experience with our being only the absolute's mental objects. Objects of thought are not things per se. They are there only for their thinker and only as he thinks them. How then can they become severally alive on their own accounts and think themselves quite otherwise than as he thinks them? It is as if, James says, the characters in a novel were to get up from the pages and walk away and transact business of their own outside of the author's story. The autonomy here denied to fictional characters is a freedom from the author who has created them. James' point is that if an individual human subject were merely the mental object of another mind, standing in the same relationship to this mind as the fictional character does to its author, it would similarly be without capacity for autonomous self-expression. The comparison helps to clarify what's so distinctive and original in the idea of heteronymy. For a heteronym is not a mental object, but a mental subject, a virtual subject transforming its author into another I. Why should I look at twilights, Pessoa writes, if I have within me thousands of diverse twilights, and if besides seeing them inside me, I myself am them on the inside and the outside? Stephen Crites, by contrast, says of Soren Kierkegaard's pseudonyms that nobody would mistake them for the voices of real human beings. They are altogether theatrical creations. They are sheer personae, masks without actors underneath, voices. Kierkegaard does sometimes describe his pseudonyms, which he also sometimes calls polyonyms, in a manner that makes them sound more like heteronyms than conventional pseudonyms. He's keen to stress that he is simply their producer, or the occasion for their production, or a prompter, a souffleur for them, but not their author. He says, "What is written is indeed therefore mine, but only so far as I have put the life view of the creating, poetically actualized individuality into his mouth in audible lines. For my relation is even more remote than that of a poet who creates characters, and yet in the preface is himself the author. For I am impersonally or personally, in the second person, a souffleur who has poetically produced the authors." Yet Kierkegaard goes on to deny that he is himself any of his pseudonyms, and says that he has no opinion about them except as third party. Remarks which imply that a Kierkegaardian pseudonym is also still a third party, and not an essentially first personal, another I. Pessoa's heteronyms, as John Froe puts it, are not personae, masks through which the poet speaks. They are autonomous figures which allow him to take on quite different personalities in his writings. Polyonyms, again, are multiple names for the same object, and they give rise to puzzles of their own, most famously the puzzle of explaining how identity statements containing them can be informative. Solutions to that puzzle, such as distinguishing between the reference of a name and its sense, the mode under which the reference is presented, are of little help, however, in understanding the phenomenon of heteronymy. For a heteronym is another I, not the same I under another mode of presentation. One of Pessoa's most basic philosophical concerns is with what I shall refer to as the grounding problem for subjects. This is the problem of accounting for the metaphysical grounds for individual subjects of experience, what it is they exist in virtue of, what they are due to, what they are dependent on for their being. The invention of heteronymy serves to underline the fact that there is no solution to this problem in attempts to reduce subjects to merely intentional objects, such as are the characters in a novel. Neither is it the sort of metaphysical problem that can be solved at the level of linguistic analysis alone. A closer, if still inadequate, analogy would be with one of those stories in which each chapter has a different narrator writing from a first-person position, such as Orhan Pamuk's novel My Name is Red, or William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, or Ryonosuke Akutagawa's short story In a Grove, on which Akira Kurosawa's film Rashomon is based. Each character in one of these stories presents in the first person and is not merely reported on from a third-personal perspective. Each one takes it in turn to occupy the narrator position. And yet, a sequence of distinct narrators writing in the first person is still not a display of heteronymy. They are distinct characters taking it in turn to speak about themselves in the first person. There's no suggestion that any of them is identical to the author, and neither can any be described as the author transformed into another I. Nor does Jorge Luis Borges yet explicitly describe heteronymy in his brilliant story The Circular Ruins. In this story, someone, whom Borges describes only as the foreigner, sets out to dream into existence another human being, having understood that the task of moulding the incoherent and dizzying stuff that dreams are made of is the most difficult work a man can undertake. Within his directed dream world, he fashions a youth whom Borges describes as a phantasm and a simulacrum, an individual who is not a man but the projection of another man's dream. Pessoa too describes the creation of heteronyms as acts of directed imagining, but the distinction between a simulation and a simulacrum is crucial, for there is no suggestion at any point in Borges' story that the dreamed-up simulacrum is the foreigner himself, another I of the dreamer, which is what would be required if the simulacrum, a virtual object, were to be a heteronym, a virtual subject, a simulated occupant of the subject position. Borges ends the story with a twist. The foreigner is given to understand that he is himself a simulacrum, as, quote, with relief, with humiliation, with terror, he realised that he too was but an appearance, that another man was dreaming him. It's within the dream of another man that the foreigner exists as a simulacrum. And in the phrase, he too was but appearance, there's a clear implication that what's being created is a merely intentional object. The simulacra in the directed dreams, as the characters in a novel, are virtual objects. A virtual subject, on the other hand, is a simulation, a heteronym, a transformation of the author into another I. Pessoa anticipates Borges when he writes, I begin to wonder if I exist, if I might not be someone else's dream. I can imagine with almost carnal vividness that I might be the character of a novel, moving within the reality constructed by a complex narrative in the long waves of its style. What's important to appreciate, though, is that Pessoa is not offering this as a description of heteronymic subjectivity. It's the simpler idea that one might discover that one is, after all, a simulacrum oneself. The grounding problem for subjects begins with the assumption that subjects are not merely apparent, and yet reluctant to grant them the status of fundamental pieces of the world's furniture, asks what their existence is dependent on. We are more like shadows than hallucinations. There is, in fact, in the circular ruins, a trace of the idea of heteronymy, but it's not to be found in the relationship between the foreigner and his dreamt-up simulacrum. When Borges writes, quote, the foreigner dreamed that he was in the centre of a circular amphitheatre, the embedded use of the personal pronoun he situates the foreigner within his own dream. Indeed, when one dreams, it's not uncommon for one to oneself figure in the dream as the one to whom the events in the dream are presenting. The subject within the dream is both a virtual subject and a simulation of the dreaming subject. And for this reason, it would be entirely appropriate to describe the subject within the dream as the dreaming subject's heteronym in the dream. Evan Thompson, in his magnificent book Waking Dreaming Being, uses the language of virtual reality gaming to make the interesting suggestion that the distinction between the subject within the dream and the dreaming subject is analogous to the distinction between an avatar in a virtual world and its user. He says, we need to distinguish between the dreaming self and the dream ego, between the self as dreamer and the self within the dream. Continuing, in a non-lucid dream, we identify with our dream ego and think, I'm flying. In a lucid dream, we think, I'm dreaming, and we recognize that the dreaming self isn't the same as the dream ego, or how we appear within the dream. The dream ego is like an avatar in a virtual world. The dreaming self is its user. In a non-lucid dream, we lose awareness that we're imagining things and identify with the dream ego as the I. We're like gamers who identify so completely with their avatars they forget they're gaming. In a lucid dream, we regain awareness of our imagining consciousness. Non-lucid dreams frame experience from the imagined perspective of the dream ego. Lucid dreams reframe experience from the perspective of the imagining and dreaming self. Lucidity can enable the dreaming self to act consciously and deliberately in the dream state through the persona of the dream ego, which becomes like an avatar in a role-playing game. It's not, though, quite correct to characterize the relationship between the dreaming subject and the subject within the dream as being that there are two distinct subjects whose distinctness is overlooked in an act of mistaken identification. The foreigner in Borges' story dreams that he is in a circular amphitheatre, and there's no question of an error due to misidentification. It's not that in his dream a certain simulacrum is in the amphitheatre, a simulacrum which is mistaken by the dreamer to be himself. So the analogy breaks down, and instructively so, for the way it does so helps us better to understand the difference between avatars and heteronyms. The difference is that an avatar is a virtual object, a simulacrum, but the subject within the dream is a virtual subject, a virtual occupant of the subject position. What it means to be at the subject position within the dream is indeed that the dream experience is framed from the perspective of this position. And by positioning himself there, the dreamer has in fact created a heteronym, an I within the dream. So he cannot use this heteronym as a gamer might an avatar, or a master might a slave, because it does not stand in an appropriately third-personal relationship to it. It's literally correct to say, in my dream I was flying, and this statement is not a mistaken rendering based on a false identification of, in my dream my avatar was flying. The idea of heteronymy is much better captured in Yasumasa Morimura's multiple self-portraiture under the assumed identities of famous historical artists, if indeed Morimura would be willing to affirm, I am myself them, on the inside and the outside. As in My Name is Red, the text for his video piece Ego Symposium has each participant, each of whom is a famous figure in the history of art, take turns to speak for themselves in the first person. The reason this does not reduce to a case of sequential first-person narration by a series of distinct narrators, and the reason it's not merely a case of successive pseudonymous disguise, is that the viewer is never in any doubt that it is Morimura who is assuming, that is simulating, each participant in turn. Though made to resemble Frida Kahlo or Johannes Vermeer, Morimura makes no attempt to hide himself or pretend not to be there. The representation is of Morimura as Kahlo, not Morimura as if Kahlo, not Morimura pretending to be Kahlo. The Portuguese novelist José Saramago provides a superb illustration of the idea of the heteronym in a short notebook entry about Pessoa. He imagines Pessoa looking in a mirror and seeing his reflection, in turn, as Reich, as Cairo, and as Campos. My name is Ricardo Reich. My name is Alberto Cairo. My name is Alvaro de Campos, he declares in turn. When he looks again later that night, the mirror image he sees is that of his own face. My name is Bernardo Suarez, he says, invoking an almost orthonym. Saramago writes, on one of those days when Fernando passed in front of a mirror, he spied in it at a glance another person. He thought this was just another optical illusions, those ones that happen when you're not paying attention, or when the last glass of eau de vie has not agreed with his liver and his head. But he cautiously took a step back just to make sure that, as is usually assumed, when mirrors show something, they do not make mistakes. This one, however, had indeed made a mistake. There was a man looking out at him from inside the mirror, and that man was not Fernando Pessoa. He was a little shorter, and his face somewhat dark-skinned and completely clean-shaven. Unconsciously, Fernando brought his hand to his upper lip and then breathed deeply in childlike relief. This moustache was still there. One can expect many things from an image that appears in a mirror, but not that it will speak. And because these two, Fernando and the image that wasn't an image of him, were not going to stay watching one another forever, Fernando Pessoa said, my name is Ricardo Reich. The other man smiled, nodded, and disappeared. For a moment the mirror was empty, bare, and then right away another image appeared, of a thin, pale man who looked as if he were not long for this world. It seemed to Fernando that this must have been the first one. However, he made no comment, merely saying, my name is Alberto Cairo. The other did not smile. He merely nodded slightly, agreeing, and left. Fernando Pessoa waited, having always been told that when there were two, a third will always follow. The third figure took a few seconds to arrive, and he was one of those men who looked as if they had more health than they know what to do with, and he had the unmistakable air of an engineer trained in England. Fernando said, my name is Alvaro de Campos. And this time he did not wait for the image to disappear from the mirror, but moved away from it himself, probably tired from having seen so many people in such a short space of time. That night, in the small hours of the morning, Fernando Pessoa awoke, wondering whether Alvaro de Campos had stayed in the mirror. He got up, and what he found there was his own face. So he said, my name is Bernardo Suarez, and went back to bed. So finally, and to conclude, let me stress that a heteronym, let me be completely clear, is not a Cartesian soul. A Cartesian soul is a putative denizen in the actual world, an immaterial mental substance standing in some mysterious relationship with other real entities such as human bodies. Lacking in spatial location, there's nothing to pair particular souls with particular effects. If two souls simultaneously acquire or lose a certain property, there's no way, even in principle, to decide which of the two was the cause of some subsequent event. This is what Jaegwon Kim called the pairing problem for Cartesian souls. Then there is, as Bernard Williams puts it, absolutely nothing left to distinguish any Cartesian I from any other, and it's impossible to see any more what would be subtracted from the universe by the removal of me. A heteronym is an aspect of a virtual world, although As we have seen, it's not a virtual object like an avatar. What is subtracted from the universe by the removal of a heteronym is an entire style of feeling, and styles of feeling are also what's added to the universe by the invention of new heteronyms, new virtual subjects.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonardon. We're going to have a conversation now, and if you'd like to join it, please do enter your questions into the chat function, making them as clear and intelligible and as concise as possible to help us out. I've got quite a lot of things I want to follow up on myself, but actually, before we do that, one of the ways in which you try to explain what a heteronym is by contrast with things which it might superficially seem to be similar to, such as a pseudonym, persona, and avatar. And actually, a question we do have from Kelly Drew is asking really for another opportunity to explain by contrast. This time by contrast with asking how one distinguish heteronymity from, for example, a method actor improvising in theatre. Right. Okay. So yeah, a method actor inhabits somebody else's from the inside, lives them in that way. So again, it's just an opportunity to explain by contrast. How would you? What's the significant differences between the method actor inhabiting and a different I, if you like, and a heteronymic inhabiting of another I?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's a really nice example. Yeah. Well, the difference isn't that sharp. I mean, I would need to know a little bit more about what actually happens in the mind of a method actor. I know that they think themselves into the character, but what does a method actor actually do? They try to insofar as they try to have an experiential relationship to the character, which involves kind of inhabiting the character's manner of feeling, way of experiencing, then that relation does seem to me to be heteronymic in spirit. So yeah, I mean, it all depends really on what goes on inside the method actor's mind. But I can see that one thing that you might say that goes on would make it sound a lot like a heteronym, assuming a heteronym, the relationship of assuming a heteronym. As long as it's not a mimetic relationship, as long as it doesn't involve imitation, but actually embodying, becoming the character in some pretty robust sense of the term, then heteronymy seems to be quite a good model for explaining what's going on in method acting. The distinction between method acting and simply acting.
Yeah, thanks very much. Now, in the you mentioned the poem "Countless Lives Inhabit Us," and that title sounds like it's a description, if you like, that countless lives do inhabit us. Pessoa's work was a very deliberate work. It was kind of a project, and so it might seem that these countless lives sort of need to be created and explored. So I'm interested in the extent to which this theory of heteronymy, this model of heteronymy, is describing something which is supposed to be, if you like, a universal feature of human experience, or how much it's more to do with describing a kind of project which we can engage in or not engage in.
Yeah, that's a good question, Julian. I just had another thought about the method acting thing. That there is one salient difference, and that's this: that the experiential world of the character of the character being acted is already given. It's given by the playwright. So it's fixed in advance by the playwright, and what the actor is doing is inhabiting a skin that's been already given in advance. Whereas Pessoa's heteronyms are persona that he himself creates. He is himself the author and the agent of them. So if you think that's a significant difference, then that's something that could be emphasized. As to your question, I think that the answer I would give is that what Pessoa is describing, excuse me, is a universal feature of the subjective human life. It's just not one that normally becomes visible. It's like you only kind of discover certain features of fundamental reality if you smash particles together at really high energies. It's not, they're not evident in everyday being of normal things. And it was only by undergoing various extreme experimentation in the nature of subjectivity that Pessoa kind of cracked the surface and discovered certain features about subjectivity which aren't normally evident in everyday experiential life. But that doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that they're not visible. So I agree with you that countless lives inhabit us as a description. It would be better to say countless lives can inhabit us. It's not necessarily the case that we are the substrata of multiple heteronyms all the time, but that possibility always exists for all of us, and can't be. And once you acknowledge that possibility exists, then it has implications for the way that you live and the way that you understand your experiential life, which can't be forsaken.
One sort of parallel which I want to sort of try to explore a bit, perhaps. I was very struck with a line from another poem in which was, "I am merely the place where things are thought and felt." And if you used to read that sentence just by itself, I guess you might be reminded of kind of the Buddhist conception of the self as there being not self in the sense of no thing there, but really the place where things arise and so forth. Now, it seems to me that Pessoa is coming at this whole question of the nature of the self from in some ways a very, very different angle. At least hasn't got the same theoretical framework. At the same time, there's also that element of just paying close attention. I just wondered, did you have any thoughts on how Pessoa's insights could relate to, illuminate, or challenge the Buddhist conception?
Yeah, I did. In fact, I've got a whole chapter on that very question in the book that I've recently published. The whole discussion goes back actually to a famous essay written by Richard Zenith, who's also the translator of the Book of Disquiet and of much of Pessoa's prose and poetic writings. And he wrote an essay asking whether Alberto Cairo is a Zen heteronym, exploring the idea that there's something Zen-like in Cairo's way of experiencing the world. I didn't say much about Cairo in my talk, but his way of experiencing the world is to be as direct as possible. Here's a stone, here's a tree, here's me. Not to interpret the data, but just to have a very direct form of confrontation with reality, and not to allow conceptual constructs to interpose themselves between oneself and one's experience of the world. And that does sound like a very Buddhist recommendation for how we should the Buddhists say that we should see things as they really are, and that conceptual constructs are just forms of fabrication that lead us astray, bewitch our intellects. So there's a lot to be said for the suggestion that the heteronym Alberto Cairo is a Buddhist heteronym. Now, whether it's Zen or whether it's some other type of Buddhist is, have to get into the details of Buddhist philosophy to decide that. I argued, in fact, that it's not really Zen, but there is a Buddhist school called Yogacara, and Cairo is certainly a Yogacara. So it sounds like a Yogacara heteronym. And in fact, Pessoa was... Sorry, Julian.
Go on.
Pessoa was actually very well read in Indian philosophy. His library was preserved and catalogued, so we know what books he had. And in fact, we also have his annotations of those books. And you find in his library quite a lot of books on Indian philosophy, on Buddhism. So we know that he was reading Indian philosophy. He was also at one point influenced by Theosophy. He translated theosophical texts into Portuguese. So he was by no means unacquainted with the rudiments of Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, another sort of perhaps line of comparison, and as you point out, you're much more steeped in this than myself. And one talks about Buddhism, but of course there are many forms of Buddhism, and it's always a bit of a generalization to just say Buddhist as though it captures everything. But again, in lots of forms of Buddhism, it's my understanding there's a kind of a reluctance to engage in what might be called metaphysical speculation. As you said there, we must address things as they are, and as they are is really as they're given to experience. And you talked about this grounding problem for subjects, this question of what is it that underpins us. And so there was a question here from someone going by the name of Vanished One, which sounds like quite a suitable name for someone engaging in a discussion on Pessoa, who says that multiple heteronyms were skeptical of metaphysics. Can a virtual subject contrasted with a Cartesian soul escape distaste for metaphysics as a prolonged form of latent insanity, which is apparently a quote from Suarez, one of the heteronyms. So, I mean, I know you touched on this a bit in your talk, but I mean, is that really part of what Pessoa is trying to do philosophically? Tell us to, see certain forms of metaphysics as a prolonged form of latent insanity, and if so, what is the nature of that insanity?
Yeah. Let me think about this. I mean, I think Pessoa was certainly skeptical about systematic philosophy. He did in his early youth, he did try to write systematic philosophy, but as he matured as a thinker, he became quite skeptical about the pretensions of systematic philosophy. And often when people talk about metaphysics, they mean systematic metaphysics. They don't mean having beliefs about the existence of the external world or something like that. They mean systematic metaphysical theorizing. I think Pessoa was quite skeptical about that. That project, the project of doing systematic metaphysics. And you can understand why, because one of the fundamental motivations for the whole framework of heteronomy is that there are many different ways of experiencing the world, many different forms of encounter with the world, and we shouldn't preclude any of them from ourselves. We shouldn't say there's just one right way of experiencing the world, and all the other ways are wrong. He was a pluralist, and he wanted to say that we can enrich our experience by being open to many different ways of experiencing the world. So for that reason, we'll be skeptical of metaphysics. There's another form of skepticism that's quite prominent in Pessoa, which is to be skeptical of a sharp distinction between what's given in ordinary perceptual experience, and what one finds in works of the imagination. For Pessoa, I think that the imagination was just as powerful a way of accessing reality as perceptual experience. And the objects of imagination were just as real as objects of senses. So he was skeptical of a distinction between real and imagined, or between real and dreamt. So that's another form that his skepticism could have taken.
I mean, the title of the talk was, the poet as philosopher, and I just wanted to ask something a little bit more about, taking poetry and literature as philosophy. You just said how he kind of rejected systematic philosophy, and I think that certainly for people who've been doing philosophy in the Anglophone world for like the past 100 years, there seems to be something sort of quite fundamentally distinct between philosophy as a discipline and literature as a discipline. A distinction which perhaps isn't as sharp in some other traditions. I can't remember the name, unfortunately, but I remember there was a Shinto philosopher in Japan who sort of talked about the need for poetry as arising from the fact that there were certain things where language lacks the precision or the capacity to capture an aspect of reality. And he said something like, where I cannot capture whatever my thoughts are in straight prose, that's when I kind of need poetry. Do you think that if we are treating poetry and literature as philosophy, are we to a certain extent having to expand our understanding of what philosophy is? Or is it rather a case that we have to appreciate how literature and poetry can do philosophy in a familiar way, or perhaps even a third option I haven't mentioned?
Right. Well, you said we there, and of course, since a large part of my academic life has been exploring how they do philosophy, where they are the Indians, and the ancient Greeks did philosophy in a very different way than we do philosophy. So it's very dangerous, really, to think that philosophy proper is the way that we do it. I mean, I think that the ancient Indians were doing philosophy. They were, of course, the style of writing in the Upanishads isn't something that would get published in the Journal of Philosophy, but I don't think it's any less philosophy for that than for that. So I think what needs to happen is that we need to broaden our sense of what philosophy is. And one way we can do that is precisely by seeing how other people in other cultures and at other times did philosophy. And certainly in many cases, there was a far more literary quality to doing philosophy. The second thing that I would say is that, armchair philosophy has quite a bad reputation, and sometimes justifiably so. You get people writing philosophy of physics who've never been into a lab and haven't got a clue what an actual physical experiment looks like, and the same is true for sometimes of philosophers of mind. Philosophy of mind is supposed to be that discipline in which explores the nature of human experience, lived human experience. But the people who explored that, the people who did the experiments about that, were the the literary figures, with the poets, with the novelists. They're the ones who have explored the nature of lived experience the most fundamentally. And regrettably, it's often the case that philosophers of literature don't actually read much literature, So I think you need to kind of, I mean, somebody like Pessoa, he wasn't a trained philosopher. He wasn't always able to formulate his insights with the kind of analytical clarity or rigor, draw all the fine distinctions that a paid-up member of the philosophical profession might be able to do. But his insights into the nature of human experience were often far more profound than those of an armchair philosopher. So I think that potentially the idea is that there's a very productive symbiotic relationship between the poets and the philosophers, that they're doing complementary work, and there shouldn't be the antagonism. There wasn't the antagonism between them in certainly not in India. I don't think in China either, but in the European tradition, there has historically, since Plato, been an antagonism between the two.
I mean, you said there that he wasn't able to put his insights into those formal, systematic, philosophical modes, and that makes me wonder whether that inability was a lack in himself, or whether or not actually something would have been lost if he had done so. I mean, for example, I kind of have this recurring sort of irritation, which is that if I go to an art gallery, I often find the curatorial notes that accompany these things really quite banal. You have this sort of piece of work which in some ways seems to be quite profound, and it ends up becoming some generic, put into sort of straight prose, it's generically saying the work questions the distinction between appearance and reality. And you go, well, okay, that's not very interesting as a bit of prose description, but actually the work's doing something. So is it partly the case that if you do try too hard to sort of translate these insights, which come in a more poetic form, into more literal language, that rather than elucidate them and make them clearer, you can sometimes perhaps dilute them and make them less interesting?
Well, I mean, sometimes that happens, but I don't think it's necessarily the case. I mean, I wouldn't go that way myself, because that's to say that philosophy, that's to put limits on philosophy. That's to say that there are kinds of human experience that can't be understood philosophically, and I don't think I would agree with that. I mean, I don't see why we should limit philosophy in that way. It's just that you need to, if anything, it's a call to expand philosophy. If you find that the tools and techniques of 20th century logical positivism can't explain what's going on in a work of art, so much the worse for logical positivism. You need an enriched apparatus, philosophical apparatus, and someone like Pessoa, what he precisely provides challenges to is for philosophers to enrich their conceptual frameworks, to enrich their philosophies of mind, to be able to make sense of the kinds of phenomena that he's describing. So I'm kind of optimist about philosophy. I think it has the capacity for that enrichment. I don't think it's got some kind of fundamental intrinsic limitations, but we always have to avoid didacticism and thinking that some one philosophical theory has all the answers to all the problems.
Yeah. Now, I mean, talking about expanding, R, I think in this case being the sort of canonical sort of Western philosophy conception of what philosophy is. there's a question from Fabio which relates to this. Now, this does go slightly beyond the scope of your talk. So if there's something you have nothing to say on, please do say. But he's talking about his Pessoa's essay on rationality. And as the question will come up, is containing the last two words of a previous sentence. But really, this question is simply this. Do you have any thoughts on Pessoa's idea of rationality? If that is something you've got something to say on, I think it would be interesting for us to hear.
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. Yeah, he did write essays on rationalism in his early days. It's not a topic I've given a lot of thought to. I mean, those very early essays that Pessoa wrote, like in his late teens and early 20s, they have been collected and they have been published. But if he was one of my students, I would probably give him a B+ or something. I don't think they were great, and I haven't devoted a lot of attention to them. Although perhaps I should have done. Perhaps there are some hidden gems there that I'm arrogantly dismissing, finding his more mature heteronomic work so much more interesting. So don't have a lot to say about it, but that's entirely mea culpa on my part. I just haven't looked at it very, 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 very hard.
That was a bit of a curveball, given that you didn't mention the essays in the talk, so a little bit unfair to throw that at you. We've got another question here. It's always quite interesting, of course. People's names here are often not their names at all. I don't think this person is called Scottish Centre, but that's the account they're coming from. And I find this interesting because you were making a comparison with Kierkegaard's pseudonyms. And Kierkegaard was a writer who wrote a lot about irony, and he used a lot of irony and also parody. So the question is, what is the place of irony and or parody in the figure of the heteronym? And how does this affect the way in which we consider Pessoa qua poet, writer, or philosopher?
Yeah, when I get questions like this, the teacher instinct starts to kick in. And, I want to ask the questioner further. I want to kind of interrogate the questioner a little bit more to find out what's going on inside their mind. It's like having a tweet, you have to kind of interpret out of all context. So I would like to know from the questioner just what's going on inside their mind when they're asking this question. It's hard to answer it in the total abstract.
Do you see? Let's put it this way: Do you see elements of irony and or parody in Pessoa's heteronomic work? And if so, what is it doing?
Yeah, I mean, there are two ways of answering that question. One is to say that the principal vehicle for irony is the pseudonym. Socrates was the primary ironist, and Kierkegaard was a great ironist. And if irony is a matter of putting on a mask, pretending to have a view that you don't really hold, then pseudonym is the ideal for that. And insofar as there's a distinction to be drawn between the pseudonym and the heteronym, the heteronym is a much more authentic way of writing, a much more authentic way of documenting one's experience, because one isn't putting on a mask. When Pessoa writes as Cairo, he's not putting on a mask. He's not hiding his true intentions. He's living and experiencing authentically in the manner that Cairo does, and writing poetry in that manner. So that's one way to answer it. But there are plenty of people who write about Pessoa saying that he was a parodist, a par exemplar, and that you can't really take anything he says simply at straight value. That he was a great game player. And that's also true. I mean, you have to be very careful when you're reading Pessoa not to take anything really at simply at straight value. Even his prose non-fiction writings, it'd be a mistake to take them simply at straight value, at face value. So I mean, what the one thing that I would want to emphasize about Pessoa is that there is this tradition which begins with Socrates and stresses the value of irony in the philosophical life. And I think that in so many ways, Pessoa is an anti-Socratic figure, and that a lot of his philosophical outlook is anti-Socratic, including, of course, his philosophy of self. So I'm kind of wary. I'm kind of cautious of using the framework of irony in interpreting Pessoa for that reason. That I don't regard him as in the lineage of Socrates and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and thinkers like that. I regard him as very much wanting to break away from that lineage.
Could you just say a bit more about what makes him anti-Socratic? That's interesting, and I think we got a little bit of a taste of it, but it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about why you think he's anti-Socratic.
There's really no hint of the tripartite soul in Pessoa. Pessoa's understanding of the nature of selfhood and what it is to live as a human being and to have an authentic mode of experience, precisely in its multiplicity, in the idea that in its fluidity, that each of us is capable of infinite variation in our styles of experience, is a break from the dominant way of thinking about what constitutes authenticity in human experience. So it's anti-Socratic in that sense, that he's rejecting, the possibility of giving a unitary account of the unity of the human self. That there's a kind of a fundamental desire for some form of unity or integrity. That's what makes him a modernist thinker. I think I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that he's a modernist thinker, and it's if there's something common to that tradition of modernist thinkers, it's the kind of that they don't think the search for the unity of the human soul is a defensible project. Just that Pessoa radicalized it. He didn't talk about the fragmentation of the self as the others did. He talked about the multiplication of the self, of the pluralization of the self, which was a much more radical and uniquely Pessoan idea.
Just following up on that, there also seems to be a sense in which, a couple of phrases that sort of stuck out from your talk were depersonalized self-awareness and an exercise in self-alienation. It almost seems to be this sort of paradoxical thing that in order to understand oneself, one has to detach from oneself almost in a way. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about what's meant by those phrases and perhaps how we can use those ideas to better understand ourselves?
Well, there is something paradoxical, or at least apparently paradoxical, in Pessoa's thought. But on the one hand, he speaks about being a meeting place for a whole coterie of heteronyms, which seems to imply that this meeting place, this depersonalized, theatre stage, is not itself a person. And on the other hand, you've got this theme of the pluralization of the self, so that one isn't just a single personality, but a plurality of personalities. And other authors have noticed that this apparently paradoxical feature in his philosophy of self. I don't think it is a genuine paradox, but I think that solving the paradox does lead one to have to go deeper into the way that he's thinking about human consciousness. There's an analogous paradox that arises in the context of dreaming, which is that you might have a dream in which you're at the center of the dream. You're in the dream. You're looking out into, supposing you're dreaming that you're sitting in a chair, and you're looking out into a room, and there's somebody who's sitting on the chair opposite you, and you recognize that person as being yourself. It's Julian Bagini sitting there on the chair in front of you, and that seems paradoxical. How can it be that you are the one at the center of the dream, looking at another person, at a person sitting opposite you in the dream, who you recognize as being yourself? But in fact, it's not really paradoxical, as long as you say that in the dream, the one that you are is the one that's at the center of the dream world, the one that all the dream experiences are being presented as two. So in the dream, there is the word. If I say I'm dreaming that I'm looking at Julian Bagini, then in the dream you're not Julian. So what I called in my talk the subject position is the position from which the world is presenting itself, and that's variably occupied. That can be occupied by a different individual at a different time. It's the same with Pessoa and in relation to his heteronyms. In his Cairo poems, he is Cairo. In his Reich poems, he is Reich. In every case, he's the one at the center of a world of experience, but that's the one who's there at the center is different in each case. So we hold fixed the idea of there being a center of a field of experience, but we're allowed to vary who is occupying that central position. And sorry, it's got a bit technical, but that's the way that we can solve the paradox. We can both have there being something fixed and also allow for the kind of variation. So basically what this comes down to is that all this talk about being both a plurality of heteronyms and a depersonalized meeting place sounds paradoxical, but if you use this framework of centers, multiply occupied centers of fields of experience, you can actually resolve the paradox. That's far too short a summary. Again, in my book, which I'm not meaning to promote, I do devote several chapters to discussing this in enormous amount of detail.
Your publisher would tell you should indeed be promoting your book, and it's totally fair to do so. Now, one sort of like professional hazard of doing a talk on philosophy is there's almost always a question where somebody asks, how does what you said relate to the work of X on the assumption that you will have read X like you've read everybody, right? And if you reveal the fact that you haven't read that person, they say, "But that's ridiculous! Your work is so clearly related to it." So quick question, if you make a question. Heidegger, do we go there or do we not go there?
We don't go there. We don't go there. Yeah, we don't go there. I mean, the only thing I would say is that I do think that Pessoa is a phenomenologist, but he's totally out of the mainstream of German and French phenomenology. There was actually a very vibrant. There are actually many phenomenologies, and the Heidegger, Sartre, Husserl branch of phenomenology is just one of them. There was actually a very vibrant branch of phenomenology in India, founded by K.C. Bhattacharya. That was also a branch of phenomenology. And I think Pessoa, in his own way, founded a third branch of phenomenology. You can call it the Portuguese branch of phenomenology if you want to. Unfortunately, he didn't have any followers, so it was a short-lived one. But phenomenology is all about, exploring the structure of human experience. Then both he and Heidegger were phenomenologists, but different branches, very different branches. And I don't think he ever read Heidegger. I don't. There's no evidence that he read. He did. There is evidence that he read some Nietzsche, but I don't think he ever read Heidegger, or vice versa.
Okay. Now, this isn't a talk of self-help at all, but I am curious, of course, that this idea that heteronyms are things that we can explore if we delve deeper, and there's something clearly that many writers do. I mean, many writers describe the experience of seeing the world through one of their characters, it giving them new eyes, and being surprised by what they find, what their characters do, and so forth. That's kind of quite common. But if it's not too sort of crude a question, if we're not to sort of go away and ourselves sort of become poets and writers and sort of delve into heteronymy in that way, what can we take from this? What can we, apart from being dazzled and impressed by what Pessoa does with his heteronyms, how does this perhaps can and should change how we see ourselves and how we relate to ourselves and understand and go through life?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say that the key take-home message is that our identities are not fixed. We don't have fixed identities. But your identity is in large part up to you. You have an enormous amount of freedom in constructing and choosing the identity that you want to have. So there's much more fluidity in the concept of what it is to have an identity than it normally seems. It normally seems like you're almost like you're imprisoned by your identity. That it's more like a cage than a form of authentic living. If we want to take home a message from Pessoa, is that picture is not right. That we have a great deal of freedom to choose the identity we want to have, the place that we want to occupy. We don't need to go all the way with Pessoa and say that we can have multiple identities simultaneously, although I think that's also true. But at least we can recognize that the concept of an identity is not something that's set in stone. It's something that we have agency with respect to, that we can fashion for ourselves. So that's where I'd say that it's, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for bringing this one. I don't know how many of yourselves were here this evening for the talk, but however many they were, they're all extremely interesting. Really interesting talk. Again, I've been actually Pessoa has been on outskirts of my sort of horizons for a while. There are books of his in our home which I've yet to properly read, and that's definitely given me a spur to finally pick up and read him properly. I hope you've enjoyed this evening and the series. Do remember, of course, that all our talks are available to be watched at your leisure on our YouTube channel, as well as others from previous years and other one-off events we've done. It's a real cornucopia of serious and engaged philosophy. That's us done for this year online. We hope to be back in person. If you go and sign up to our newsletter at our website or follow us on Facebook or Twitter, you'll also get some news about a couple of events coming up in person in London, which will be recorded, so that if you're unable to go to them, you will be able to watch them at your leisure later. But for now, I'll just thank you for coming. Thank you for watching. Thank you, of course, most of all, to Jonardon Ganeri for a really fascinating talk and discussion. Thank you.